The wind once roared across endless grasslands, long before any name had ever been spoken. There were no words for father, no word for love. There was no language, only breath, shallow with fear, deep with hunger. The world did not yet recognize us. We were just another animal beneath its sun. Yet even then, something stirred. In the golden haze of dusk, shapes crept across the African savanna. Upright, two-legged, slow, but watching. They stood on feet meant for walking far. They held stones, but not like other beasts. Not to chew or crush, but to change. These were not yet humans. They were more, or perhaps less. A riddle in motion. Homo erectus. The upright ones. The quiet ones who dared to chase lions from their kill. Who learned that the sharpest blade was not claw or tooth, but thought. They wandered, not aimlessly, but instinctively. East to the river, north to shelter, south when the rains betrayed them. For thousands of years, they walked. Into mountains and forests, along rivers, through deserts. From the cradle of Africa to the icy mouths of Europe and beyond. Without maps, without words, without even knowing they were exploring a world no one else had dared touch. And they carried something new with them, something no other creature ever had. Fire. Not just warmth, not just light, but commanded fire, stolen from lightning and kept alive through dry nights and wind-blown valleys. They cradled it like a child, guarded it, fed it, worshipped it, perhaps, without knowing the word. By the light of fire, they became more than muscle and bone. They became memories. They gathered around the flames in silence. There were no songs. Not yet. But there was breath. Staring into the embers, something sparked within them. A flicker of thought, not tied to hunger. Wonder. Fear. All. They saw their shadows dance on cave walls and perhaps believed, if only for a moment, that the dark was listening. They hunted. Not alone, but together. Wolves had fangs. They had each other. They ran for hours, sweating and silent, chasing antelope into collapse. They shaped tools from flint, crude, sharp, effective. Their hands remembered what their minds could not speak. And slowly, something changed. They began to care for the weak. They helped the injured walk. They fed those who could no longer hunt. A child was not just another mouth. It was the future. Some dead they left for the vultures. But others they buried. Not with ceremony, but with meaning. A stone placed near the head. A flower beside a small skull. A body turned toward the rising sun. These were not accidents. A question whispered through their bones. Where do we go when we stop breathing? And that question lit a fire no wind could smother. They didn't know they were ancestors, but they felt something, a pulse beneath the soil, a story waiting to be born. They were not yet us, but they were already dreaming. Time did not march forward then. It drifted, slow as mist, heavy as silence. Not in days or decades, but in extinctions. Homo erectus, the walkers, the wanderers, had carried fire and will across continents. But they were not alone. Beneath the shadowed cliffs of Europe and the freezing winds of Central Asia, other people carved a life from the cold. The Neanderthals. They were not myths, nor monsters, though for centuries we imagined them that way, as hunched brutes, roaring in caves. But they were more like us than we dared to admit. Their bones were thick, their hearts fierce. They built shelters. They crafted flint blades with edges sharp enough to slice through time. And when one of their own fell to illness or ice, they buried them with red ochre and antlers, not to hide the dead, but to honor them. In the dark, they painted, not with brushes, but with breath and blood and fire-lit hands. On the walls of their caves, they left shapes: bison, deer, spirals, eyes. They were not merely recording the hunt. They were remembering something more. A world behind the world. A dream behind the teeth of the sky. And then, almost without warning, we arrived. Homo sapiens. Thinner, weaker, slighter in build, but carrying something strange inside, something that could not be touched or measured. We carried madness, the kind that carves symbols into stone, the kind that names the stars and asks why, the kind that sees a shadow and imagines a god. We did not destroy the Neanderthals in fire and blood, as old stories say. No great war, no massacre. For a time, we lived side by side, shared valleys, maybe even fires. There are bones that suggest love, or at least children, born of both kinds. But slowly, Subtly, the world chose one voice to echo louder. The Neanderthals began to fade. They vanished from the caves, from the forests, from the snow-heavy mountains. Not all at once, but like the dying embers of a once great flame. Their death was not conquest. It was absorption. We took parts of them into our bodies. In your veins, in mine, echoes of their code still whisper. Mitochondrial ghosts. Bone memory. We became their tomb and their legacy. But their minds, their songs, their stories? Gone. Swallowed by silence. We buried them not just beneath the earth, but beneath our own forgetting. Sometimes, in deep caves, we still find their handprints. Still red. Still trembling. A Neanderthal mother pressed her palm to stone 50,000 years ago. She pulled it away. And now we stand there, wondering who she was. The truth? She was like you. The wind still howled through forests and across empty plains, but now, it carried rhythm. Not the rhythm of footsteps or falling rain, but something stranger. Something of ours. The heartbeat of drums. The hush of breath around the fire. The whisper of meaning trying to be born. Fire, once a terror, once a god, had become a companion. We no longer feared the dark. We pierced it. We owned it. Flames leapt high in the night, and in their glow, shadows danced. And in those shadows, we found ourselves. At night, we gathered, not just to warm our hands, but to warm our stories. Huddled around flickering light, we told of hunts gone wrong, of beasts outwitted, of ancestors now stars. Fingers drew animals in the dirt. Mouths mimicked their roars. Eyes widened with wonder. And somewhere in that stillness, language began to form. It wasn't born from books or scrolls. It came from mothers soothing children, from hunters whispering signals, from lovers breathing songs into one another's skin. It came from need, to share, to warn, to remember. Words began as growls, then symbols, then songs. They were sacred, each syllable a bridge between thought and sound. For the first time, we were no longer alone inside our minds. And with words came memory. We no longer lived only in the moment. We began to record time, not with calendars or clocks, but with scars and stories. A cracked bone, a burnt log, a mammoth's tusk left standing in the ground. We turned pain into teaching. Children listened wide-eyed as elders spoke of spirits in rivers, of moons that watched, of dreams that warned. The world around us became alive, not just with danger, but with meaning. A snake wasn't just a snake. It was betrayal. A bird in winter wasn't just a bird. It was a sign. The earth became a text, and we learned to read it. Our hands, once just for grabbing and cutting, are now painted. With ash and berries, with blood and bark. The walls of caves transformed into cathedrals of memory, filled with galloping horses, charging bison, and handprints pressed in defiance of time. We didn't know what art was, but we knew what all felt like. We knew how to marvel. We decorated our bodies. We pierced our ears and lips. We danced, not to celebrate, but to connect, with each other, with ancestors, with whatever watched us from the sky. And in these rituals, we stepped beyond survival. We became creators. For the first time, we didn't just react to the world, we reshaped it in our image. We turned bones into flutes. We made masks from skulls. We painted our fears into beauty. We made the invisible visible. And something happened that had never happened before in the history of life. A species began to dream out loud. They say the dead cannot speak, but our ancestors knew otherwise. Long before gods had names, before temples touched the sky, before even kings or cities or crowns, humans looked at the stillness of death and saw something waiting. A truth hiding behind silence. A presence behind absence. When a body stopped breathing, the world shifted. The fire dimmed. The birds fell quiet. The wind changed direction. It was as if the earth itself noticed. And so, we began to listen. The earliest burials were simple. A stone placed near the head, a flower tucked beside a broken rib, a small child curled beside their mother. But these gestures meant more than sheltering bones from beasts. They meant memory. A boy was not just returned to soil. He was returned to the story. We buried the dead facing the east, where the sun rises. We buried them with antlers, with shells, with beads made of bone. Not to decorate, but to prepare, as if they would need these things somewhere else. This was not instinct. This was a belief. We began to treat the dead as something more than gone, as something transformed. The land around us became sacred. A hill was not just earth, it was the back of an ancestor. A spring was not just water, it was a grandmother's voice. The stars were no longer distant fire. They were the eyes of the ones who watched. We built monuments of stone. Circles, towers, rows stretching for miles. Not homes, not fortresses, but reminders that we had lived, that we had loved, that we had lost. In some graves, we find red ochre, the color of blood, of life, a symbol of rebirth. In others, broken tools, as if to say, your hunt is over. In many, a mother cradling a child. They did not bury with fear. They were buried with hope. And still, they painted. Inside tombs, inside dark places, we find art, not of the living, but of the after. Spirals, serpents, human figures with wings or horns or flame. These weren't decorations. They were messages, warnings, prayers. We were not trying to escape death. We were trying to understand it. In whispers, in chants, in the careful way a body was washed, we created the first religions. Not to control, but to cope. Not to command, but to connect. And from this need came myth. A hunter who fell into the river now rose each year with the spring floods. A girl who vanished in the woods became the moon's daughter. A great fire in the sky, the anger of an ancestor we forgot to feed. Our stories wove the world together. And as we walked through it, we walked with ghosts, not in fear, but in reverence. We left handprints not just to say, I was here, but to say, we are still here. And so death became our greatest teacher. It taught us that time moves forward, but meaning stays. Those bones may break, but stories don't. That the voice may fall silent, but the echo never ends. Her name was Nika. At least, that's what we'll call her. She lived before kings, before metal, before the first seed met soil with intention. She was born beneath a sky so black it bled stars. The forest around her pulsed, not with fear, but with watching. Trees creaked like they remembered something. The river near her shelter spoke in tongues older than words. She was not a princess. She was not chosen. She was human, at the edge of humanity. She ran barefoot across roots and rocks. She knew how to silence her breath when a shadow passed. She could read the broken twig of a branch the way a hunter reads blood on snow. At night, she lay curled beside her mother, watching the fire leap and hiss. And there, in the crackle and glow, she dreamed. She dreamed of the wolf. Not a beast to be feared, but a teacher, a mirror, a being of hunger, yes, but also of loyalty, of song, of night. She watched them from the cliffs. How they moved without waste. How they mourned their dead. How they belonged to the dark without surrendering to it. One night, the wolves came close. Too close. The tribe gathered spears. Nika stepped forward. No weapon. No cry. Just stillness. The alpha looked at her. Not with pity. Not with rage. But recognition. Then, silence. The wolves vanished. But something inside Nika had changed. She began to mark stones with lines. Not random scratches, but memory. She tied feathers in her hair. She stood alone under the moon and whispered to the wind, not knowing what she said, only that it needed saying. The elders watched her with unease. She listens too much to the sky, they said. But others listened to her. She told stories. Of a world before pain. Of rivers that healed. Of wolves that remembered names. And in her telling, something spread, not just belief, but identity. The tribe began to mimic her symbols. Her chants. They buried their dead with flowers now, not just stones. They left bits of food at the edge of the woods, just in case the spirits were hungry. She had no crown, but she was the first kind of queen, the queen of the unseen. Nika never claimed power, but she carried it, like embers in her chest. She lived, she aged, and one day she died. No one carved her name into bark or bone, but they told her stories. To their children, and their children's children. Somewhere, in a cave not yet found, her handprint waits. Pressed into stone, surrounded by red ochre and ash. You've seen it before, even if you haven't. Because every time you feel the pull of something ancient, every time you dream of wolves in the woods, every time you stare at fire and feel watched, it might just be her. Nika, the girl who listened to the dark, and heard something divine. The earth shifted, mountains cracked, rivers changed course, skies turned gray with ash, and humanity, once united in wandering, began to divide. Not out of hate, not yet, but out of need. We had followed herds for thousands of years, across valleys, through rainforests, beneath glaciers. But the great beasts began to vanish. The mammoths grew fewer. The skies held more lightning. The earth gave less in return. And so, we stopped moving. We planted seeds. We waited. We watched. And the waiting changed us. It was slow at first, barely noticeable. But it happened. We tamed grain. We bred sheep. We dug canals, built fences, wove baskets to carry the harvest. We stayed in one place and called it ours. And in that claiming, something ancient stirred, territory. Before, the forest had no owner. The river ran free. Now, this stream is where our spirits drink. That hill is where our ancestors sleep. This field is where we buried the child of fire. Lines were drawn, not with ink, but with bones. Boundaries were sung, not written, but they were real. And when someone crossed them, the story cracked. Disputes began. Small ones, at first. A hunter from one tribe stepping into another's grove. An animal killed on the wrong side. A ritual interrupted. Words turned to warning. Warnings to shouts. Shouts to blood. It was not yet a war. But the idea of war had been born. Some tribes flourished. Their crops grew tall. Their gods grew proud. Others watched their children starve. The rain betrayed some. The sun punished others. And in that imbalance, suspicion bloomed. Why do they have more? Why does their sky listen and ours stay silent? Did they curse us? Magic was blamed. Then vengeance was sworn. From sharpened sticks to obsidian blades, we learned to kill not just for survival, but for belief, for land, for memory, for revenge. And still, in the quiet moments, we mourned. Even the killers wept. Because deep down, something remembered the time before the fences. Some still wandered. Nomads of the old world. Traders, story keepers, peacemakers. They moved between tribes like ghosts, carrying myths across borders. They were respected and feared, because they reminded us of who we used to be. But most no longer saw the world as whole. They saw us in them. And yet, even in division, beauty bloomed. New languages, new songs, new gods with new faces. The moon was now a mother in one tribe, a scarred hunter in another. The mountain was a throne here, a wound there. We did not agree, but we began to imagine differently. Culture took root where borders formed, and where lines were drawn, civilization soon followed. But with it came a shadow, a voice that whispered, "You must protect what is yours." And another replied, "Then take what is theirs." They found it during the rains. The mountain had cracked open, not with thunder, but with a slow sigh, as if the earth itself was exhaling after holding its breath for 10,000 years. At first, it looked like a cave, dark, silent, swallowed in shadow. But it wasn't just emptiness. It was a mouth, not one that spoke, but one that remembered. The elders refused to go near it. "This is the place where the gods sleep," they said. "This is where the world dreams." But the youth, curious, fearless, foolish, went in. They took torches soaked in fat, their flames flickering against damp stone. The walls breathed. The air smelled of soil, ash, and something older, something like memory. Then they saw it. Marks. Not natural ones. Not carved by water or claws. But humans. Lines scratched deep into stone. Spirals. Stars. Figures with arms raised to the sky. Hands, hundreds of them, pressed into the walls in red and black and ochre. Some small as a child's. Others wide, ancient, fading. They were not alone. Not now. Not ever. And deeper still, they found the bones. Stacked. Arranged. A skull placed atop stones like an altar. A ribcage wrapped in bark. A femur painted with circles. Not random. Not careless. Ceremony. This was no shelter. It was a temple. A grave. A memory chamber. A place where the living whispered to the dead and expected whispers back. The tribe outside waited for their return. When the youths emerged, they were pale. Quiet. One cried without knowing why. Another could no longer sleep near the fire. They had seen something. Something true. And soon, the whole tribe gathered. They brought offerings, fruit, feathers, blood from the hunt. They sang, not songs of joy, but songs of reverence. They called the place the womb of the mountain. Because what is a grave if not a place where something waits to be born again? They believed the spirits lived there, not as ghosts, but as watchers. Not angry, not kind, just present. Stories began to grow. Children were told, if you lie, the mountain will remember. If you break a promise, the mountain will whisper your name into the wind. If you are brave, go inside and leave behind your fear. The cave became part of them, not just physically, spiritually. A wound in the earth they could not close, would not close, because it held something they had always longed for. Proof that they were not the first, that others had come before. I felt pain, had buried their dead. I prayed. It made them feel small and yet infinite. And so, they painted their own hands alongside the old ones. Generations layered into rock. Not for glory, not for gods, but to say, we were here. We remembered you. Please remember us. Before the field, there was a herd. For countless generations, humans followed animals. Deer, bison, aurochs, not just for meat, but for movement. They were our guides. We trailed their migrations the way a compass follows north. And then one day, a tribe, tired, hungry, brave, did not follow. They stayed. They watched the hooves vanish over the hill. And instead of chasing them, they dug their fingers into the dirt. They found seeds. Tiny, fragile, seemingly useless. But something in them whispered promise. They planted. They waited. They were worried. And the earth answered. Green tendrils rose. Soft at first, trembling in the wind, then bold, wide, reaching toward the sun. They had tricked time. They had made the future grow. Farming was not just an invention. It was a revolution. No longer did we chase the herd. We called food to us. We domesticated grain, barley, millet, taught them to thrive under our hands. We bred animals not just to eat, but to live beside us. The first goats bleated in woven pens. The first dogs slept near our fires, not as threats, but as family. Villages sprouted where once there were only camps. Stone by stone, we built walls, not just to keep things out, but to hold ourselves in. And with walls came names. This is our land. That is our spring. These trees belong to our ancestors. Identity took root in soil. For the first time, a child could be born, live, and die without ever leaving their valley. The horizon became less of a mystery, more of a border. And in that stillness, we created clay pots, baskets, grain stored for winter. We carved gods from wood, faces that smiled like mothers or scowled like storms. We began to count, to measure, to remember time not in moons, but in harvests. But even as we tamed the land, something inside us remained wild. The old songs still echoed at night. Around fires, elders still told stories of the time when we ran with the wind, of the girl who danced with wolves, of the mountain that remembered your name. There were tensions. The earth gave, but it also withheld. Droughts came, crops failed, and when that happened, we wondered, have we angered the soil? Have the gods turned away? We made sacrifices. Animals, sometimes more. Religion was no longer a whisper. It was an institution. Temples rose beside rivers. Priests memorized the sun's path. Prayers became law. And yet, we still danced. We still loved each other. We still remembered the days before the seed. Because even as we built villages, we could not forget the forest. The child who watched the fire still lived inside us. They rose from the dust like dreams given shape, the first cities. Not just shelters or villages, but worlds unto themselves. Walls of clay baked by the sun, wide roads of packed earth, rooftops lined with reeds. Children chasing goats between huts. Smoke curling skyward like prayers with no names. This was not nature's design. It was ours. We had learned how to bend rivers, to force soil to yield, to build monuments that defied wind and time. We stacked bricks as if everyone carried a story, and they did. With cities came something new, something dangerous, order. Not the kind sung by birds or whispered by rivers, but human order, enforced by rule. Suddenly, not everyone was equal. Some lived near the temples. Their feet never touched mud. They wore cloth dyed with crushed shells and flowers. Their words became law. Their symbols became currency. Others swept streets, dug ditches. They bled in silence. But they still believed. Because in the center of it all, rising above the city like a mountain carved by will, stood the temple. It was not just a house of worship. It was the spine of power. Priests recorded the movements of stars, charted omens in bird flight, and told the people when to sow and reap. They held not just prayers, But calendars, contracts, debts, language changed. No longer painted on stone or sung beside fire, now etched into clay. Cuneiform, hieroglyph, symbol into sentence. We had begun to write, and we would never stop. And with writing came memory's greatest weapon, history. The rulers carved their victories into stone, but they did not carve their crimes. In markets, people traded fish for grain, wool for copper. Voices shouted, coins clinked, arguments rose. And in the noise, something ancient began to fade. No longer were stories carried by wind or carved into trees. They were bound in scrolls, buried in vaults, owned by those in power. But still, in secret, under moonlight, grandmothers told old tales. Of the girl and the wolf. Of the cave that I remembered. Of when humans followed stars, not kings. Not everyone was content. Some questions. Why do we starve while they feast? Why must gods live in palaces while we sleep in dust? And sometimes, cities burned. Walls crumbled. Statues shattered. But always someone built again. Because once we tasted civilization, its rhythm, its purpose, its promise, we could never return fully to the wild. Our hearts beat to the drum of order, even when it crushed us. And so the city stood, sometimes glorious, often cruel, but always human. We stand now, not in caves, not in forests, but in cities of glass and metal, reaching towards stars. Yet when we look into the mirror, we still see flames. It's there, behind the eyes, deep in the chest, flickering with every breath. The fire we once stole from lightning. The same fire we cradled through ice ages, protected in storm, whispered prayers to in the dark. It never left us. It simply moved inside. We are the children of wanderers, of the girl who whispered to wolves, of the ones who buried their dead with flowers, of the tribes who drew borders in the dust, and the dreamers who dared to erase them. Our blood remembers what our minds forget. The rage, the awe, the hunger for meaning. Even now, in skyscrapers, in cars, in digital webs spun across continents, we are searching. We ask the same questions the Neanderthals might have whispered beneath the aurora. Where did we come from? Where do we go when we die? Who watches us from the stars? We've changed. Yes, we wear shoes instead of calluses. We hold screens instead of stone blades. We fly, we code, we count atoms. But we still paint. On walls, on skin, on light itself. We still sing when words fall short. We still love with a desperation no language can tame. We still mourn as if grief were sacred. We still dream wildly and without apology. And we still carry stories, not just to tell them, but to become them. You are not just a name, not just a job or a face in the crowd. You are a line in an ancient tale, stretching 7 million years back and echoing forward into galaxies not yet born. You are what the stars dreamed when they died. You are what the earth whispered when it first turned warm. You are what the fire saw and chose to follow. So light your own flame. And remember, the handprints on the cave wall were not left behind. They were passed forward.